and welcome everyone to this Q&A with the National Star Student Union today, and Carlo, Salvatore and Sue Elsegood, who should be joining us in a little bit. Carlo and Sue were activists whose actions were fundamental to the implementation of the Disability Discrimination Act in 1995. Carlo, welcome today. The Student Union have done a bit of research and watched a film in which they've seen yourself that was on the BBC to prepare for this. And they saw a film of some of the protests a few years ago now. And they've prepared some questions for you, if that's okay.
Yeah.
But firstly, would you be able to just let us know a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm Carlo. I've been off and on, I guess I've been an activist for about 30 odd years, not right the way through, but somewhere around there. I'm a community worker. I've been a youth worker in various settings for about 22 years off and on. I was the first disabled sessional youth worker, as far as I know, in the borough of Islington in London. And I'm also an independent advocate for like more than one borough. I work a lot on a voluntary basis, mainly supporting disabled people in Greenwich. But I'm also about to start seeing if I can help some other people in Merton, which is sort of Surrey way. And that's me. And anything else you want to know about me, you can ask as we go along.
And Carlo, the Student Union do have a lot of questions for you. So should we start with some questions?
Absolutely.
Okay. I think, Molly, did you want to start?
Has your life changed dramatically due to the protest in a positive or negative way?
Oh, dramatically. Well, it's definitely easier to do things in terms of getting about when you've got some aims about what you'd like to do with your life. So infrastructure, which is the things in life that helps you get about, helps you get from A to B, transport. You could argue that kind of thing got a bit better. I find it that if you're friendly and you approach people on an equal basis, you can get more done. So it is fairly dramatic if I compare it to something like the early 90s, when it was much, much harder to get accessible taxis. And there was still no accessible transport, buses and stuff. Yeah, it's been good in some ways.
Carlo, I don't know whether you realise or not, but we've, I don't know how much you know about National Star College, but we're not just on one main site.
That's it.
We've also got a site in Hereford. So I'm going to ask Katie from Hereford to ask the next question.
Oh, it's like Eurovision.
Exactly.
What made you want to help people with disabilities?
Yeah, I do, and that's what I've been trying to do. The reason, for instance, that film you saw with myself and Sue and others in it, the reason that film was made at the beginning was that it took at least 14 or 15 attempts, as far as I can remember, to get that law through. It took ages. In Parliament, where they make laws, they could also make it very difficult for these laws to keep going ahead, because they talk them out till there's no more time left. That's a lot of the reason why it took about 14 or 15 goes to get the Disability Discrimination Act through. Yes, so I very, very much enjoy and am committed to helping people with disability. Yeah, really good question. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carlo. Thank you, Katie. And from one Katie to another Katie, Katie in Cheltenham.
What do you think has changed since the DDA started?
Oh, you are putting me on the spot. I think, not to get too technical, I think there's lots of things, particularly to do with buildings. There's codes that people have to operate with now. There's like access regulations, and I believe most public buildings have to comply. It means they have to go along with these regulations. There was a time when people said, oh, can't do it because the building's not big enough, can't have a loo that's equipped because we can't afford it. And that kind of example, that's just an example. But some of you may have heard of a campaign that's called Changing Places, just as an example, where they have had to provide much larger accessible loos in buildings. So most public buildings, most museums, most nice places where people want to go and meet up, art galleries, libraries, and that kind of thing. They can't just say, oh no, sorry, we can't do it, we haven't got the money. They have to do it because of something that came after the DDA, which is called the Equality Act 2010. That's in a way works alongside the DDA, but it's in some way it's frameworks like that have hopefully made life better. But it's still a struggle. And the other thing is partial access to things like trains, although that could be a lot better. So I hope that helps a little.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carlo. You mentioned the Equality Act, so I'm going to hand over to Harshim, if possible, please.
Thank you. My question is related to that. What's your view on the 2010 Equality Act? And how is it different to the 1995 Discrimination Act? And I've heard that it's a watered down version. So if you could elaborate on that.
I think it's actually the first way around. I think the DDA, the Disability Discrimination Act, is arguably the watered down version, because there was something called the Harry Rams Bill, which got talked out. I think it was mentioned in the film. And in some ways, there would have been a lot better than the DDA if it had gone forward, because it would have had more force as a charter of rights, in a way. What the disabled people's movement really wanted at the time was a charter of rights, something that could be really heavily enforced. Instead, we ended up with the DDA, but the DDA, think of it positively, was a milestone. As I say, after 15 attempts, it's good that it was still there. Now, the Equality Act firmed some of the provisions up, as I've been trying to say, like with buildings, like with transport, like with access to services. The idea of the Equality Act is people are not supposed to discriminate against disabled people in providing these services. Now, being a bit of a devil's advocate is a bit of a point to say whether people do want to discriminate against disabled people. So you could argue that there's some going on there, because people, unfortunately, in operating services, they will always say that there's not the money.
I agree with all.
They're all too
They
quick
will
to
always
say
find-
they haven't got the money.
And also, you're right. It's disappointing that it didn't, get voted down. That, but unless we see more people with disabilities in, position of power or in advocacy groups, we won't get there.
That's right. And in a way, it's a circle, because that's why we need avenues of protest in different ways. That's why we need to work out common aims and directions and work together inclusively as disabled people and develop plans to campaign and push for what we need. So you're absolutely right. One thing arguably leads to the other. And if the community works together, we can open up even more.
I hope.
Fantastic. I'm just going to point out that Sue has joined us. Hi, Sue. My name's Andrew Evans, and I'm just sort of supporting the student union to ask yourself and Carlo lots of questions. They've done their research on the Disability Discrimination Act. They've seen you in film on the BBC. So it's really nice to meet you. So we're working through our questions.
Yeah, I'm glad to join you. Great to meet everyone.
It's nice to meet you as well. It's nice to meet you as well. So what I'll do, Sue, is I'll ask the next student, and I think our student union president, Elliot, has been waiting quite a long time to ask his question. So I'll ask Elliot to ask his question next, please.
Great.
What was it like getting around and right before the Disability Discrimination Act? I felt like some examples of discrimination act had been heard before the act, but were absurd.
Oh, thanks for that question, Elliot. Well, that's an excellent question. It was really difficult to get around before the discrimination, because the public transport system, if you was in a wheelchair, wasn't accessible. So it was like a case of, if you had a private vehicle, you could possibly get around, or you could just about get as far as you could go under your own steam or in your own wheelchair.
Yeah.
But it was really hard to get around. It was hard to get in shops because they often had steps and no ramps. It wasn't against the law for them not to let us in. And on the train, we had to travel separately in the guards van, which was where the mail would travel on the train.
Yeah, and the chickens.
Yeah, so you had the ramp, and they would get a ramp to get you into the guards van because it had double doors. So it was the only place on the entire train. So if you were in a wheelchair, you could get in. But there was no heating, and there was bars at the door, and it was like in a locked cage because of security for the post. It was so we weren't travelling equally and offered. I remember when I was at college, going on the train to college, and the guards forgetting that I was on the train. So I'd be carried on to the next station and the next station because there was no other passengers to tell that you were stuck.
And putting it even more basically, Sue, disabled people were discriminated against simply because the government or society at whatever level in terms of services simply didn't have to do anything about it. They had no obligation. They weren't obliged to do it, so they didn't. So that was a huge level of discrimination right there.
Yeah, it was really hard. And I mean, another story about the discrimination that we experienced was, for example, I remember we did a protest against a restaurant called the Good Fare Restaurant in Campden High Street because it had a sign up saying no wheelchair users allowed, no disabled people entry sign. And it wasn't because we couldn't have got in that particular restaurant, it's because they didn't want disabled people in there because they thought it was bad for their image and it would put other customers off their food. So the sign up, and this is very reminiscent of racism that was experienced back in the day before the anti-discrimination legislation around race, because there used to be signs saying no black, no Irish, no dogs. And we had those signs up. We've seen them. We did a protest. That was it about the restaurant not allowing disabled people in, and we did a protest to demand they took the sign down. But that was before we got the DDA legislation. So of course, nowadays it would be discriminatory to put a sign up like that.
I think the story you just told us about the restaurant and sign would lead nicely into one of Daniel's questions.
So Daniel's trying to say, why do you do, take that from me, why do you do what you do? Did you get that, Andrew?
Yeah. I got that. So why do you do what you do was Daniel's question.
Yeah.
To change things, to make things more inclusive, to help people that come after as society develop. Sue?
Yeah, I mean, I felt like we had no choice to do what we did and to do what we're doing. It's to create a fairer and more equal society, and to ensure that everyone can be included and participate, because we all have the right to have a life and be part of life and contribute to life. It's certainly, when we started, I think Carlo would agree, we had to, because if we wanted to get out, we had to do something about the transport system. If we wanted to get a job, we had to do something about the discrimination around employment and every other area of life. So there wasn't really an option. I felt it was a kind of number one priority at that time.
That's very good, Sue, as well, because the other thing that's connected with all this, if you make things better, then you're showing society, showing the world that we matter, that we're to be valued, that we have skills, and very importantly, we as disabled people are not just having things done to us in inverted commas, that we're operating and affecting things ourselves with the help and support of allies and others, and we're changing things ourselves as well. The better, hopefully, and I don't just mean us. I mean all of you here today wanting to find out about these things, and that's how it works. And rather than people making weird assumptions, thinking that disabled people just want things done to them.
Freddie, over to you with your question.
Okay. Did you have a job when you were protesting?
Oh, would you like me to start this one, sir?
Could you repeat the question? I couldn't quite hear it.
Did any of us have a job? I think Freddie was saying.
Oh, right, yeah.
While we were protesting.
Go for it, Carlo.
That's a bit of a weird and interesting one, actually. At one stage in the 90s, I think it was, I had at least 2 jobs. I was working in the community centre as an access officer, and I also worked for a volunteer transport organisation for a London borough. So off I went to a protest in one of this organisation's vehicles that I was working for, and these quite brightly coloured yellow vehicles, and the volunteer driver dropped me off because there was nowhere to park, and off I went to meet the other people at the protest. And unbeknownst to me, during that day, I was being caught up with by something like ITV News. And suddenly later in that day, I had a camera shoved in my face and they were interviewing me. And I was in this electric wheelchair with a bright yellow frame and a black seat. So like canary yellow frame. So I could hardly get away. And anyway, I did the interview, but I also had my son was very, very small at the time. So I had quite a bit on my plate. And the next day when I was in the office, having got back from the protest, I got a call from the funders of my wheelchair because it was a work-related wheelchair. And they were not happy. They were telling me off for using my equipment for those kinds of purposes. So I had to point out on the phone that we were in fact a campaigning organization and I was campaigning, which they didn't quite understand. But they put up some resistance, but by the end of the conversation, they said, well, we hope you get what you want, so that actually worked out quite well. But they did threaten me with wanting the equipment back and stuff like that. So I had to really point out to them that it was related to my work. So sometimes you're not supported in what you do, but it was quite funny, particularly the interview on ITV, completely unexpected.
Can I just set the scene, Carlo? Because the protest was to have ramps and lifts on buses.
Yeah, it was.
And we'd stopped the traffic on Tower Bridge.
Yeah, and this
quite a dramatic scene, wasn't it?
That was very good. And this I'm just trying to say sort of relatively quickly. But yeah, that's absolutely right. The volunteer driver from my organization warned me, because I said I was out of the office. They didn't actually know I was going to join this protest. So the guy said to me, well, I actually haven't got anywhere to park, because obviously it's slap bang in the middle of London. So I'm going to drop you off somewhere safe. And so we did that. And once my wheelchair was on the road, it was so empowering. It felt so brilliant. Crossing the bridge, just on my own, completely in this fantastically bright, totally conspicuous wheelchair, zooming towards the fellow friends and fellow protesters. It was such a brilliant feeling. It felt like almost like, I don't know, like being an astronaut and doing something, you know, really amazing, and like just watching your friends getting closer and closer. It was brilliant. I'm ever so glad I did that. Very powerful.
Yeah, it was quite poignant, the fact that you work for community transport, because
Yeah.
that was important at the time. It was a bit like Dynamite, and that's all that we could use at the time if we wanted to go further afield, and we had to ring up days in advance to try and book a ride on
And
community transport or Dynamite, and usually you couldn't even get through. It was so busy.
And even if you rang up, I don't know, before 8 o'clock, at silly o'clock in the morning, like well before 8 o'clock, the lines were jammed within about half an hour. So you had kind of bob hope and no hope of getting a ride, really. So through the organization that I worked with, because I was a paid worker, and through the extended project that I actually operated with the job share partner that was there to enable disabled people to go beyond that borough. You know, we were actually trying to extend disabled people's opportunities with transport, and the people that were supposed to be making it easier in terms of equipment to do that job were actually obstructing us and getting in our way.
Yeah, and the wheelchair that you talked about, Carlo, was an access to work wheelchair, wasn't it?
Yeah,
And
that's it. Yeah.
because in those days, even wheelchairs from the wheelchair service were only an indoor powered chair if you were lucky, or manual chair. So for Carlo or myself to be able to get further than our own house, we either had to use a chair that we'd saved up for years for ourselves, or Carlo was using the chair that he'd used in the office. But it was restricted, it was supposed to be restricted to the office.
And they wanted me, in theory, they wanted me to pay for another one, i.e. to have one for work and one at home, which at that time, because they were only prepared to fund one in theory. So I said, oh yeah, sure, I'll have 5 of these, no problem. It's no problem getting one of these. Because at the time they cost about £1,600, £1,800, and that was in the 90s. And I said, what do you expect me to do? Because they basically, they didn't want me to take it home until I argued that it was safer to keep it at home than it was in the office. But that's the kind of resistance people that you met with at the time.
Fabulous, thank you guys.
Sue?
Yeah, so things have improved in some respects quite dramatically. So like now people take it for granted to go to the bus stop and queue up for a bus, and to be able to get on the bus, or to be able to travel to travel more spontaneously. So that's a big difference. And I guess now we have rights around goods and services, so people have to make reasonable adjustments for us to access goods and services.
Now they can't keep you away from shops, even though some people are still unhelpful. As I said before, there's quite subtle ways of barriers keeping on being there. Like there might be some kind of test in terms of education or some mechanism where some funders might say that it's harder to access something. But at least one of the main things now is people have to give you reasons. They have to give you arguments why they supposedly can't do something. And I say supposedly because quite often they can. It's just a fudged set of reasoning that makes them reluctant to comply or bring something forward. So it's much harder for them to say no, basically, in terms of goods and services, although people will still try. And one example is the transport case fairly recently. There's a campaigner called Doug Pawley, who used to just sit at the bus stop with the buses going past him, and the bus operators excluded him a lot of the time because of where the bus stop was, until he won a case, a very important landmark case to do with that area of society. So it's very, very important to argue the case, and it's much, much harder for people operating things, working things, to just give a blanket no, disabled people can't do something. But it's not ideal.
Thank you, Carlo. Thank you, Sue. Which leads me on to Alex over in the sports classroom.
What can I do to help?
Sue, I'll chip in.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we would really love to see is for younger people to start to get involved with campaigning and community work around disabled people. So I would say if you've got a local deaf and disabled people's organisation in your area, I would encourage you to join that organisation and to see what you could do there. Or if you have a local DPAC, which is called Disabled People Against the Cuts, they're like a campaigning group that emerged after Dan and thing with transport and the DPA. So Dan, we are still meeting actually as Dan, which is the Disabled People's Direct Action Network. We're kind of informally meeting and considering whether we're going to do some more protests, because obviously right now with the pandemic, disabled people have been disproportionately impacted, and we feel like there's still a lot of work to do around equalities and health and the equalities of disabled people in residential nursing establishments. So we have been active, and So obviously, if we get Dan really and truly back up and running,
Don't worry. Don't worry about the physical nature, the physicality of getting out somewhere. We realize it's really hard in practical terms to get somewhere. Where what Sue said was absolutely spot on. Find an area that you're interested, that you can identify, because you can't take everything else on. You can't take everything on at once. Find an area that really needs improvement. Get friends, get allies, get on the internet, form a group. Like we have a Dan group, for instance. Form a group, get together, write to MPs, but also do other things. If you can, do a Zoom and say that the next thing you're going to do after that Zoom is you're going to turn up at someone's town hall with some placards and banners, so you can ramp it up in different ways, and you can make your presence felt, definitely.
And Daniel, I think you had another question as well that you might like to ask.
Can you tell me any stories?
Can you tell me any stories?
Yeah. So okay. So we did our first international protest, which was in Wales, in Cardiff. One of the reasons was that the Queen Street station, which I think you saw in the film, the Dan film, the platform was platform 2 was inaccessible. One of the platforms had a lift, but the other one didn't. So we decided we would go and chain ourselves to the train on the platform we could get to. And so we did that with handcuffs and chains, and somebody got under the train. So it was really quite daring, to be honest. Obviously, we made sure the driver knew there was someone under the train. And then we obviously we were there for a while. We stopped the trains from moving, and then the police came to remove us from the train and arrest us. And some people got arrested and put into the police vans and taken to the police station. But I was they started questioning me, asking me whether I could stand or walk, which obviously I couldn't walk or stand. When they realised I wouldn't be able to in any way get myself out of my chair, and they'd have to lift me in my powered chair into the police van, they decided they were going to de-arrest me. So I got a bit furious because I felt like everyone else around me was getting arrested. All my friends, all my campaigning friends were getting arrested. But the reason I was being left behind was because their vans didn't have a lift or a ramp. So I felt even the police were discriminating against me at that time, which is like, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry really, because it was quite good in a sense, I guess, not to be able to be arrested. But on the other hand, it was another layer of inequality after inequality, and I'm very calm usually, and so that did rattle me a little bit. So that's yeah, we had quite a lot of adventures on that protest in Wales.
The thing is, it really showed that the police, I mean, I'm sure we weren't criminals, but in a wider way, I'm sure there are disabled people that get in trouble. But it just showed that the police didn't have the means to, they didn't have a clue how to behave. They didn't have the structures, Their vans weren't accessible. Probably the cells or the environment you couldn't even get in. You know, it was a non-starter right from the beginning. Really, I think that was an example of one of the absurd things that one of you was talking about earlier on.
Thank you both. Just briefly, Carlo, you mentioned you had another story as well. To
Yes.
finish on would be perfect.
Again, with the Cardiff one, this is a really heartening one. We had members of a community choir while we were chanting as protesters about the trains and transport. They just sat in the middle of the road amidst the police and everyone else and started singing in support of the disabled people. I've very, very rarely been in the midst of something so completely powerful, because you could tell that we had plenty of support, and it felt like the whole community at that point, and even some of the police, were directly on our side. Undoubtedly, there were people who knew what we were trying to do, and many of them shared our aims. So it was very, very powerful.
That's super. Thank you, Carlo. Thank you, Sue.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
A pleasure. It's really good. We should do it again. Definitely do it again sometime.
Thank you, Carlo. Yeah, thank you, Sue. It would be interesting to do it again sometime.
I want to protest.
Alex would like to protest.
You'd like to protest? Good.
That's great. Get in touch with us.
Keep in touch with us,
Yeah,
and we can chat about stuff.
yeah.
Okay.
Maybe after the pandemic, mostly.
So I think we'll call it a day there, guys. But thank you so much, Carlo and Sue, and thank you, Student Union, for all of your questions as well. Carlo and Sue, the amount of questions they'd originally come up with, we would have been here all day.
Well, that would have been
So
brilliant.
it would have been great. It would have been great fun, to be honest with you. I'd have really enjoyed it. So we had to narrow them down.
Absolutely.
So thank you to everyone for today. And hopefully Carlo and Sue will see you again soon.